Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take your sources, dig in, and pull out the key knowledge and insights just for you.
That's right.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into the incredibly rich and complex history of Iraq. We're using a detailed document titled A Brief History of Iraq as our main guide here.
It's quite a document.
It really is. It sweeps across millennia, from the very earliest days in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, all the way through ancient empires, Islamic golden ages, foreign influence, independence struggles, revolutions, wars, right up to modern challenges.
And what's really striking, I think, is how this document balances Iraq's huge foundational contributions to history with the persistent struggles for power, influence, and stability that have marked its more recent centuries.
Right.
So our mission today is basically to follow that long, intricate thread. We'll pull out the key moments, the pivotal changes, recurring themes, all to help understand Iraq's present by looking at its past. And crucially, we're drawing only from the information in this specific source.
Exactly. Just what the document tells us. All right, let's get into it. Let's unpack this incredible history, starting right at the beginning, where the source starts its detailed account.
Sounds good.
Okay, so the source takes us straight to ancient Mesopotamia, that famous Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates. What does the document say makes this region just so significant in, human history?
The source puts it right at the very beginning. It calls this area the earliest among the main world civilizations. It's highlighted because, it's the birthplace of incredibly foundational inventions, things that literally shaped, everything that came after.
This is where it gets really interesting, like foundational for modern life, kind of interesting. What are some of those specific inventions the source credits to Mesopotamia?
The document's quite explicit here. It lists things like the abacus, the alphabet, maps, even beer.
Beer, okay.
Yeah. And it specifically calls out the Sumerians. The source says they emerged around 3500 BC for developing cuneiform script. That's one of the very earliest writing systems.
Right, cuneiform.
And the wheel for transportation, major advances in mathematics. Plus, they mastered agriculture, developing sophisticated irrigation canals.
So not just simple tools, but really foundational technologies, things that allowed for cities, trade, complex government. Stuff we still rely on.
Exactly. Key building blocks.
The source then walks us through the major empires that rose up in or really influenced this region. Can you guide us through the main ones it mentions?
Absolutely. The document traces this succession of powerful groups. First up, the Akkadian Empire, around 2350 BC. These were Semitic peoples. The source mentions Sargon founding the city of Akkad, the Akkadian language appearing, and rulers like Naram-Sin expanding its reach, even conquering Sumer. Then later came the Babylonian Empire, around 1792 BC. The source describes them as pure Semites, blending with the Sumerians. It really highlights the time of Hammurabi.
Famous for his code, right?
Well, the source focuses on it being a period of peace, rebuilding, and international recognition for Babylon. It attracted foreign tribute. And this Old Babylonian period, it notes, also saw the rise of Semite astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, real intellectual development.
Interesting.
And then further north, you have the Assyrian Empire emerging around 911 BC. Their homeland was in what's now northern Iraq. The source notes the Assyrians, sometimes called Chaldo-Assyrians, included many Christians, specifically the Nestorian sect, and had deep historical ties to farming. It lists apples, wheat, olives. It also mentions their nomadic hill herds and points to descriptions in ancient texts, like from Strabo and Herodotus, who wrote about the amazing ruins of Nineveh.
Right.
And the source even points out the significance of the excavations there in the 1840s, where they first deciphered previously unreadable script, a huge breakthrough.
Wow. And this region wasn't just birthing empires, it was also absorbed into others over time.
That's exactly right. The source is very clear that before the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, the land that would become Iraq was part of the Persian, Macedonian, Seleucid, Parthian, and Sasanian empires. It was clearly a strategic prize.
So looking back from today, what's the big takeaway from this deep dive into these ancient origins?
I think the source makes a really powerful point here. This isn't just, dusty ancient history. It establishes that the land of Iraq has this almost unparalleled legacy. It's the cradle of core elements of human civilization, writing, math, complex society, key technologies, even beer.
You can't forget the beer.
Right. It really sets an incredibly high historical bar for the region's significance on a world scale.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Moving forward quite a few centuries, the source brings it to the 7th century and the arrival of Islam. How does the document describe this, well, profound transformation?
The source starts with the rise of Islam itself, beginning with Muhammad's preaching in Mecca around 610 CE. It emphasizes this simple monotheistic faith standing against the prevailing pagan beliefs at the time. It notes the initial persecution, the strategic move to Medina, where the movement really gained strength, and then the return to conquer Mecca in 630 CE.
So it started regionally in Arabia, but then expanded incredibly quickly.
Exactly. The source really emphasizes the sheer speed. It says that within just 1 year of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Arab tribal confederations had conquered all of Arabia and were already launching campaigns against the huge Persian and Byzantine empires.
Wow. 1 year.
Yeah. It specifically highlights the Battle of Qadisiyah against the much larger Persian army as a crucial victory. It basically annihilated the Sasanian forces, paving the way.
And where did Iraq fit into this rapidly growing empire?
Iraq was one of the very first territories conquered, starting around 634 CE. Cities like Hira, Al-Kufa, even the historic Babylon fell to the Muslim armies pretty quickly. The source notes the whole Sasanian Empire was subdued by 651 CE. This led first to the Umayyad Caliphate until 750 CE, and then the really famous Abbasid caliphs.
The Abbasids, right. That's a name many people know. What were the major changes under this early Islamic rule, especially in Iraq?
This is a period of massive transformation, according to the source. Iraq, especially with newly founded cities, became the absolute center of this new empire. The capital of the caliphate was actually transferred from Damascus to Iraq.
Okay.
And Baghdad, in particular, founded by al-Mansur in 754 CE, made the capital in 762. The source describes Baghdad almost immediately becoming prosperous. It was known as the City of Peace, the City of Wisdom, a real magnet for scholars, learned men from all over the empire.
The Islamic Golden Age.
That's exactly what the source calls it. This era, under the Abbasids, particularly under caliphs like Al-Mahdi and Al-Mamun, is explicitly described as the Islamic Golden Age, a time of immense intellectual, cultural flourishing.
And economically.
Big developments there, too. A sophisticated tax system was set up. Irrigation projects progressed, drawing on older Persian knowledge. A thriving class of wealthy Arabs and non-Arabs emerged in cities like Al-Kufa and Al-Basra. Canals were dug, repaired, crucial for farming and trade in Mesopotamia. And Arabic became the official language of administration.
It really sounds like the region hit a new peak in terms of influence development.
It absolutely was. The source emphasizes this period as a high point of development, urbanization, cultural achievement. And Iraq, specifically Baghdad, was right at the heart of the Islamic world's intellectual and economic life.
Okay, fast forward again, several centuries this time. The source brings us to the arrival of the Ottomans in 1534. How did their rule change things for Iraq?
The source says the conquest itself was relatively smooth. It helped that the Persian Safavid dynasty, which had been contesting control, was in decline. Incorporating Iraq into the huge Ottoman Empire meant expansion for cities like Baghdad, Mosul, Basra. And crucially, the Ottomans immediately started restructuring Iraq's governance.
Right. What was that new Ottoman system like? How did it work?
Well, in the countryside, they brought in a bureaucratic system that kind of acted as both a feudal estate and a tax farm. People holding the land got a share of tax revenues in return for overseeing it and defending it.
Okay.
But the cities, the source notes, were treated differently. They stayed outside that system. Apparently, this was sensitive because cities had large minority populations, different languages, cultures. So power in the cities was kind of split between officials appointed by the central government and local oligarchies who still held quite a bit of power.
Did that system lead to stability? Or was there tension?
Not entirely stable, no. The source highlights what it calls a conflicting balance of power and constant opposition and revolts. This instability was often triggered by things like governors being frequently transferred and shrinking budgets coming from the central state.
Right.
The document gives examples like a revolt of the Kurds in 1879, resistance to disarmament in 1883, which the Ottomans met with heavy military force, bombardment. And tribal chieftains, especially in border areas, managed to gain more power and autonomy during this time.
Interesting. And how did the Ottoman era affect Iraq's connections to the wider world? Did that change?
Oh yeah, this was a major shift. Iraq got integrated into the Mediterranean world. Its focus shifted away from its older ties to the Persian hinterland. Seaborne commerce really took off, and Baghdad became the Ottoman Empire's key trade gateway to the Indian Ocean.
So more connected in some ways.
Yes, but the source points out a downside too. This focus on state-sponsored trade brought extensive new controls over transit ports, trade routes. And the result, according to the source, was that Iraq's rural economy actually contracted and fell further under foreign domination.
Oh, really? How?
Well, agricultural productivity fell, partly because traders were pushing for a shift towards producing things like cotton and grain that they wanted, rather than what was best for local needs, perhaps.
I see. So a period of integration into this massive empire, economic reorientation, but also significant internal resistance and economic problems in the countryside.
Exactly. The source presents the Ottoman era as really complex. Big administrative changes, yes. Economic redirection, yes. But also marked by internal conflict, resistance to central control, and parts of the rural economy actually shrinking, partly due to these external trade pressures. It kind of sets the scene.
Moving into the 20th century now, World War I signals the decline of the Ottoman Empire. How does the source describe Britain's role in the transition to what's called the Mandate period?
Right, WWI is key. The source explains that when the Ottomans joined the war on Germany's side, the British saw an opportunity. They exploited internal rivalries in the region, firmed up their control over Egypt, and importantly, enlisted the Sharif of Mecca to spark an Arab revolt against the Ottomans.
The famous Arab Revolt.
Exactly. And after the last Ottoman forces left Iraq, the country came under direct British military occupation.
And this is when the term mandate comes in. What exactly did that mean, according to the source?
The source defines a mandate, which was a concept floating around European diplomacy then, as basically an arrangement where one nation gets authority to occupy and rule a territory that isn't its own. The League of Nations officially designated Iraq as a mandate territory under British administration in December 1920.
Okay. And what was Britain's main interest? Why take on this mandate?
The source is very direct here: oil. Primarily concerned with oil. The Iraq Petroleum Company had been promised a valuable concession, and the source really emphasizes that shipping oil from the Mosul region was seen as absolutely vital for the British Empire's future, especially as oil was replacing coal.
Strategic resource.
Hugely strategic.
So how did this transition to British control play out, and what about the idea of eventual self-government?
Well, the source notes that while the mandate was imposed, the British did consider some form of a cautiously supervised self-government, maybe as a way to minimize discontent among Iraqis. However, the source states pretty bluntly that British methods of governance were despised, and demands for a truly independent Arab state grew louder. The idea of setting up an independent kingdom under Prince Faisal was proposed. But the source describes the 1921 vote held to endorse Faisal as king as a charade with shady procedures.
A charade.
Yeah, basically intended just to give a sort of legitimacy to what was essentially a British decision, later rubber-stamped by the League of Nations. A constitution was adopted in 1924. It gave some power to an assembly, but the source highlights that the king, who was heavily influenced by the British, kept too many veto powers. So even though Iraqis had intense political quarrels among themselves, British influence remained this constant underlying factor.
So when did Iraq formally get independence from the mandate?
The source says a treaty regulating independence was signed in 1930. Under this treaty, Iraq was admitted to the Community of Nations, and by 1945, it was a member of the League of Nations, which the source calls the most direct expression of international sovereignty at the time.
But was it fully independent? Or were there strings attached?
Well, the source notes British military bases remained in Iraq, and they were used during World War II. It also mentions a period of intense Arab nationalism that led to the pro-Axis Rashid Ali coup in 1941.
A pro-Axis coup during WWII.
Yes. And the source states this coup triggered a British invasion. It lasted less than 2 weeks, but radically changed the military policies of the monarchy afterwards.
Wow. It sounds like a really complex path to independence then. Formal sovereignty was achieved, but significant external influence driven by oil, military interests persisted and really shaped the country's early years.
That's exactly the picture the source paints. It shows formal independence being granted, but Britain's underlying interests didn't just disappear. They led to things like keeping bases, even that brief re-invasion. It highlights just how complicated that transition was.
Okay, so Iraq is now a kingdom, post-independence. But the source points to some really deep-seated problems within this new structure. What were the core challenges facing the monarchy, according to this document?
The source identifies a fundamental issue right from the start. a dual socioeconomic system. You have this large, poor sector, basically untouched by progress, isolated, and then a small, wealthy elite enjoying, as the source puts it, fabulous wealth and luxurious living.
Huge inequality.
Massive. And this created tension. The government became panicky and highly sensitive to any potential opposition. It imposed severe restrictions on liberty, expression censorship, banning books, that sort of thing.
Right.
The source also points to how the monarchy itself was set up and how internal borders were drawn. It suggests a flawed ethno-sectarian political partition drawing policy that just ignored existing social realities, arbitrary divisions, which made tensions worse between tribes and cities. Loyalty, the source notes, stayed primarily with tribe and clan, not this abstract idea of a king appointed by foreigners.
So how did the monarchy actually function politically with all these tensions?
Well, the source reminds us, the British installed Faisal as king in 1921. He did try to build a national identity, even appointed British officials, but the source says the experiment failed because, again, tribal and clan loyalty was just dominant. Local leaders saw themselves as chieftains, not subjects. There were public protests against this British-controlled monarchy, even over something seemingly small like putting Faisal's photo in a mosque. It shows the resistance to imposed authority.
And what about social economic progress during the monarchy?
The source mentions the first generation of Iraqi university graduates starting to take important jobs, administration, education, health, commerce.
Yeah.
But it also says they faced limited opportunities for equal treatment under the monarchy.
Okay.
There were attempts to revive Arabic writing, Islamic concepts. The regime did try to keep good relations with the religious establishment donations, reestablishing Islamic courts. Interestingly, the source notes that Friday sermons sometimes contain subtle criticisms of the ruling class or Western influences. Kind of hinting, you know.
Right, subtle resistance. The source then points to a massive turning point, the 1958 revolution. What does the document say finally led to the monarchy being overthrown?
The source attributes the monarchy's downfall directly to how it was established, seen by many as a foreign imposition, and the widespread opposition it faced. It argues the monarchy secured loyalty through privileges denied to most people.
Right.
This led ordinary Iraqis to blame foreign rule and the monarchy for their poor living standards, the country's backwardness, exploitation, foreign intrusion, all of it.
So deep resentment.
Deep resentment. And the monarchy's age-old mediocrity, as the source calls it, was made worse by growing domestic and external pressures. The document describes massive protests breaking out, accusations of election fraud, rising tensions, the growth of leftist movements challenging the whole system. It even mentions government buildings being bombed.
And the coup itself. How did that happen?
The source describes the coup d'etat on July 14, 1958, as being orchestrated by some disgruntled junior army officers. They seized the radio station, announced the republic, called for public support for their new ruling council. Emissaries were sent out to arrest or kill key members of the old ruling elite, which the source says was successful. It cleared the way for the Revolutionary Council, led by Abdul Karim Qasim, to take power.
And how was this received initially?
The document notes it inspired great hopes and expectations among the population. People were really looking forward to promised reforms after years of discontent with the monarchy.
So a really dramatic shift from monarchy to republic, driven by anger over inequality, foreign influence, led by military officers, and initially met with a lot of hope.
Yeah, the source paints a clear picture. A monarchy that just couldn't address the fundamental problems, leading to a violent military overthrow and the dawn of a new Republican era, starting with high hopes for change.
Okay, so after the 1958 revolution, the source describes a period of political struggle before the Ba'ath Party really takes control. How does the Ba'ath Party come to power, and how does Saddam Hussein specifically rise up, according to this document?
The source explains that the power struggle after 58 eventually ended with the Ba'ath Party seizing power in a military coup in 1968. This brought in a single-party totalitarian regime. Now, the document mentions the Ba'ath Party was already an opposition party before 1958, but there were internal differences between its civilian and military wings.
Okay.
So it was a group of revolutionary officers, supported by the Iraqi Ba'ath Party under Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, a military figure who took power in 68. As part of a compromise, some Ba'ath Party leaders got top jobs, ministerial posts, senior military roles, and this is where Saddam Hussein enters the frame.
Right.
The source states he became the first deputy president and the first deputy chairman of the Ba'ath Party's regional command. Holding those two key posts, the source explicitly says, gave him great opportunity to monitor or interfere in all ministerial, military, party, and security affairs.
So he wasn't just in the party, he was positioned right at the center of power.
Precisely. The source uses the phrase, increasingly, Saddam became the strong man behind the new Ba'athist regime, really highlighting how he consolidated control from those positions.
Okay. What were the main policies, the main goals of this Ba'athist regime, according to the source?
The source identifies several major priorities, especially in the early years, the 1970s. Controlling oil resources was paramount, developing a national oil industry. Iraq nationalized a big chunk of its oil industry in 1972, with more later, building up the industrial base, launching projects in science, investing in student education. Socialist distribution of wealth was a stated aim, and things like land reclamation, cultivating marshland, electrification, education, health services were also focus areas.
And the oil nationalization, the source connects that to bigger world events.
It does. It notes the 1972 nationalization happened alongside the Arab-Israel dispute and then the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Arab oil producers used oil as a political weapon, leading to those big price hikes, the energy crisis that hit Western economies hard.
Right, I remember that. The source also touches on human rights under this regime. What does it say there?
It's quite grim on this point. Despite Iraq signing international human rights treaties, the document says the country slipped further down the scale on severe human rights abuses, especially in the later 20th century. It mentions an exodus of refugees, terrible suffering for those who stayed because of ceaseless war and the actions of a brutal regime. It points to campaigns against dissent, violence targeting specific groups like Shiites, Kurds, Chaldeans, particularly after the 1991 war.
So a period defined by ambitious state development, yes, especially using oil wealth. But alongside that, the consolidation of totalitarian power and a really serious decline in human rights.
That's the complex picture the source presents. It details the state's drive for development, taking control of national resources under the Ba'ath and Saddam Hussein, but it explicitly balances this with the increasingly brutal suppression of any opposition and severe human rights problems, especially as the regime faced more conflict later on.
The source then turns to a massive conflict, the Iran-Iraq War. How does it describe the origins, the start of this really devastating war?
The source attributes it to persistent tensions that had simmered between the two countries for years. It states the war began with a sudden invasion by the Iraqi army into Iran on September 4th, 1980. The initial move involved missile attacks, armored brigades pushing in, aiming to seize oil fields and refineries in Iran's Khuzestan province.
And what was Iraq's stated reason, the pretext for this invasion?
The source says the stated pretext was protecting the Shiite people not only in Iraq but also in Iran, which is interesting given the later dynamics.
Right.
Additionally, the source notes there was an expectation that seizing control of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, that key shared waterway, could potentially vanquish the Iranian regime after a brief campaign. Maybe a miscalculation. The document gives some details on the early days, Iraqi artillery hitting Iranian oil facilities, Iranian F-4 jets bombing back, Saudi Arabia providing support to Iraq, implying Iraq had plenty of weapons. It also briefly touches on the state of their navies and air defenses.
And what does the source say about the long-term impact? What did this war do to Iraq?
Jumping ahead slightly to where the source discusses the aftermath, it's very clear. By the end of the 1980s, after nearly a decade of war, Iraq was financially exhausted and practically bankrupt. The economy was in ruins.
Bankrupt. Wow.
Yeah. And Iraq, which used to be self-sufficient in food, now faced huge amounts of food shortages. The source explicitly blames Saddam Hussein's bad policies and decisions for this dire situation.
So a conflict launched with specific aims, specific pretexts, which ultimately just led to immense economic and social devastation for Iraq itself.
Precisely. The source details the initial invasion, the stated goals, but then crucially underscores the war's debilitating long-term impact. It paints a picture of Iraq's economy and self-sufficiency being absolutely hammered by the conflict.
Okay, moving into the 1990s now. The source discusses the Gulf War. What were the tensions that led to Iraq invading Kuwait?
The source traces that invasion on August 2, 1990, back to outstanding tensions between Iraq and Kuwait. It stresses again that Iraq was financially exhausted and heavily in debt after the long Iran-Iraq war.
Right, still recovering.
Exactly. And the most significant trigger, according to the source, was Kuwait's actions, systematically over-extracting oil from shared border fields, violating OPEC quotas, those agreed production limits.
Undercutting prices.
Yes, and deliberately depressing oil prices through free production. The source calls this the most significant momentum pushing towards the invasion. Iraq felt economically targeted.
How did the world respond to the invasion of Kuwait?
The source states the UN Security Council approved a series of 14 resolutions to restore peace. Critically, these included authorizing military force against Iraq. This led to, as the source puts it, mostly U.S.-led forces deployed heavily in Saudi Arabia, launching a campaign in mid-January 1991.
Operation Desert Storm.
Right. The source describes the campaign as lightning, spectacular, and deadly against Iraqi forces. Iraq was effectively beaten and had to comply with all the UN requirements.
What was the situation like for Iraq after that war? In the immediate aftermath?
It was an environment of intense international oversight and sanctions. The UN set up military and civilian disarmament missions, welfare monitoring teams. A major element mentioned is the Oil for Food program, which started in 1996.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, it was meant to let Iraq sell oil only to buy humanitarian goods under strict UN supervision. The source says this program really defined the relationship between Iraqis and the UN for years.
But did it work? What was life like for ordinary Iraqis?
Despite the program, the source says the situation was dire. Infrastructure was crumbling, high rates of illness and death, scarce food supplies. The source is quite critical here, saying the blockade imposed on Iraq lasted a lot longer than it should have after the war. It argues this just made shortages worse, led to widespread poverty, a dramatic drop in living standards.
So what were the specific economic, social consequences of the war and those long sanctions, as described by the source?
The source details just comprehensive devastation. It's quite a list. Direct physical damage estimated at a staggering $200 billion. Factories, workshops, the vital oil industry hit hard.
Yeah.
The irrigation system suffered massive damage, maybe $10 billion worth. The health sector was devastated. Hospitals lacked basic supplies, leading to widespread diseases. Pharmaceutical plants completely shut down.
My gosh.
Here's severe scarcity of goods, prices shooting up, a booming black market, massive inflation. The currency, the dinar, its value just plummeted. Attempts at monetary reform mostly failed. Bungled privatization attempts led to huge frauds, and the whole economy basically shrank by half. The poor suffered immensely, becoming dependent on regional strongmen just to survive. Even schools and universities were significantly damaged.
It sounds utterly catastrophic, not just the war, but the years after. A complete societal and economic breakdown.
The source uses very strong language. It really conveys the profound, widespread damage and suffering caused by the Gulf War and then those long, long sanctions. It paints a picture of comprehensive economic collapse, infrastructure destruction, and just a severe decline in people's well-being.
Okay, the source then takes us to the 2003 U.S. invasion. How does it describe the stated reasons, the justifications given for this invasion?
The source notes the idea of invading Iraq was being considered almost immediately after 9/11, with planning starting soon after. It points out that President George W. Bush seemed openly interested in Iraq almost from the outset of his presidency. And it mentions reports suggesting he connected Iraq to threats against America well before 9/11. The document highlights U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell's presentation to the UN Security Council. That famous presentation outlining intelligence on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, arguing Iraq wasn't complying with UN resolutions. The source calls this presentation a convincing rationale for invasion, at least publicly.
But, and this seems crucial, the source immediately questions the basis of that rationale, doesn't it? What does it say about the validity of those WMD claims?
Yes, it's quite critical. It notes that internal CIA documents were apparently questioning the validity of the WMD claims as early as August 2002, months before Powell's UN speech.
Really?
Yeah. The source explicitly asks how false was his testimony and wonders if Powell just misrepresented the info he got. It strongly states that the construction of reasons for war preceded 9/11, suggesting radical regime change was contemplated long before 9/11 happened, and that the plan still needed a crowning rationale after maybe abandoning earlier ideas.
So the public reasons were contested internally, according to the source, but the decision to invade went ahead. How did the invasion itself proceed?
The source states the U.S. began its invasion on the morning of March 19, 2003. It mentions Vice President Cheney had openly stated his plans to occupy Iraq and launch a thorough war against Islam. The operation was later named Operation Iraqi Freedom. The initial phase, the source says, involved aerial bombardments hitting police stations, military sites, oil wells, secret police HQs, palaces, notably without a formal declaration of war. The source draws a stark contrast in firepower, saying the U.S. had advanced weaponry while Iraqis had nothing but rusty Kalashnikovs.
What happened immediately after the invasion forces took control? What was the situation on the ground?
The source describes a rapid collapse into disorder. By the summer of 2003, it says the nation had fallen into chaos. Widespread looting, buildings destroyed, just general disorder everywhere. Planning for what came next seemed limited. The focus was on the destruction of Saddam Hussein's regime members, as few thought of the aftermath. Ministry funds were looted, tanks were just driving on the streets.
Chaos, basically.
Yeah. The source emphasizes how fast this happened. The swift dismantling of the last vestiges of the government, and with it the state itself, happened within weeks. This created a massive power vacuum that, the source states, was quickly and violently refilled by multiple non-state actors.
And the longer-term consequences, the environment created by the invasion and this chaotic aftermath.
The source points to a fundamental issue: a lack of understanding of the nation's culture, history, economy, and the dynamics that govern the country's people. This lack of understanding, it argues, meant the reconstruction process was basically prone to failure. The source suggests a slower, more gradual political approach might have been better than rapid transformation. Reconstruction was seen as an enormously complicated task, especially since the state administration was non-existent after the bombing. The source raises the key question of who should lead this, arguing it can only be performed by Iraqis with knowledge and commitment to the interests of the nation, though it also notes the need for skilled Iraqi expatriates.
It really sounds like the source views the invasion, and especially how the aftermath was handled, as not just changing the regime, but fundamentally dissolving the state structure itself, creating a whole new set of complex problems.
Absolutely. The source makes a direct causal link. It states the rise of insurgent groups and the later sectarian violence can almost entirely be attributed to the arrival of the American troops and the consequent removal of the Ba'ath regime. It calls this period a rude interruption of what it terms a more than 2 decades-long period of comparative peace and stability, presumably referring to the time after the Iran-Iraq War ended until 2003.
The source describes a dramatic surge in sectarian violence following the 2003 invasion and that power vacuum. What does it identify as the key triggers? What was the nature of this violence?
The source pinpoints one specific event as a major catalyst: the bombing of the Askaria Shiite mosque in Samarra on February 22, 2006, a hugely important holy site for Shia Muslims. The destruction of the shrine, the source says, set off a wave of purported Shiite militia attacks on Sunni mosques and the killing of about 400 persons in the first days afterward.
A major flashpoint.
A huge one. From then on, the violence took many forms: shootings, abductions, attacks on mosques, markets, periodic bombings. The source notes some bombings were particularly destructive in Shiite areas. It also highlights how attacks were systematically changing the makeup of Baghdad neighborhoods, converting mixed districts into predominantly Shiite ones.
Ethnic cleansing, essentially.
That's the implication. A grim detail mentioned is abducted people being found bound and gagged, dumped in rivers or fields. The source also points to a coordinated series of suicide car bombings on November 23, 2006 that killed more than 200 mostly Shiites in Baghdad as another event that just poured fuel on the fire.
And this violence seems intertwined with the rise of all these insurgent groups the source mentions. How does it categorize them? Who were these groups?
The source describes a multifaceted insurgency fighting both the occupation forces and the new Iraqi government. It stresses they had differing motives and ideologies. The document breaks them down into roughly 6 types. Groups loyal to al-Qaeda, like Tawhid wal-Jihad, which became al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. Loyalists and members of the old Ba'ath Party. Tribal armed groups, specifically from Sunni provinces. Armed groups coming out of Shiite religious sects. Groups with more local communal agendas, and finally, armed criminal groups, often driven by the widespread poverty and chaos.
A real mix. How does the source connect this insurgency to the sectarian violence? Are they the same thing?
The source is careful here. It says the civil war that emerged is not a direct extension of the initial anti-U.S. insurgency. However, it immediately adds it cannot be understood without considering the conditions created by the invasion and the occupation.
Right. The context is key.
Exactly. The source basically describes the conflict as Sunni powers insurgents, tribal leaders facing off against the Shiite-led government, which was backed by the new army and police force, themselves often seen as sectarian. It highlights how groups that initially just opposed the U.S. invasion transformed into armed sectarian factions. And crucially, the source notes the focus of violence shifted dramatically away from targeting U.S. interest towards community cleansing and religious cleansing.
Wow. It sounds like this period of intense violence didn't just create insecurity, it fundamentally ripped apart the social fabric and changed the very nature of conflict within Iraq.
That's absolutely the picture the source provides. It emphasizes the deep, destructive impact of this sectarian violence, detailing mass displacement, the explosion of diverse armed groups emerging from that post-invasion vacuum, and a stark shift in the conflict towards internal, communal, religious strife.
Okay, bringing us closer to the present now. The source discusses political developments in Iraq after 2011. What does it say about the wave of protests that kicked off that year?
The source notes something quite striking, paradoxically, it says. After all those years of dictatorship, invasion, extreme violence, Iraq saw its first real protests in February 2011. These followed the pattern of the Arab Spring protests happening elsewhere, like Egypt.
Right.
Initially, these protests were peaceful, driven by grievances like corruption, constant power cuts, unemployment, lack of basic services, and violence by the security forces themselves. Pretty fundamental stuff.
How did the government, the political elite, respond to these demands?
The source says the political elite mostly stuck to what it calls an authoritarian mantra of stabilization first, at any costs. Their priority was keeping stability, not necessarily addressing those socioeconomic demands or calls for accountability. So their response, according to the source, involved mostly intensified rhetoric, governmental reshuffles, or a combination of both. Not real change.
And did the nature of the protest change?
The source says that while the underlying motives were anti-regime, the protests also concomitantly became ethnically defined. Public slogans started shifting, becoming sectarian, either for or against specific political groups. So the divisions resurfaced, even within the protests.
And the source mentions protests coming back again later.
Yes, it does. Protests over poor city services returned in the summer of 2015, again turning towards anti-regime feelings. By late 2015, influenced by anger over state services, corruption, and the shock of ISIS capturing Mosul, the protests became more violent. The source mentions 119 casualties, hundreds injured and arrested.
This period also sees a major event, the withdrawal of most U.S. troops. What does the source say about that?
It notes a significant drop in U.S. troops starting May 2011, with the withdrawal picking up speed towards the official departure in December 2011. It mentions there were jubilant street demonstrations on New Year's Day celebrating the soldiers leaving.
And how does the source link this whole post-invasion environment, the dissolution of the state, the power vacuum, to the emergence and rise of ISIS?
It makes a very strong direct connection. The source states the rise of ISIS and similar radical groups can almost entirely be attributed to the arrival of the American troops and the consequent removal of the Ba'ath regime.
Almost entirely. That's a strong claim.
It is. The source traces the origins back to organized Sunni militancy like Tawhid wal Jihad, which became Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, emerging as early as 2004. This group got a foothold in Ba'athist and tribal Sunni areas, receiving substantial fight and financial support from clan sheikhs. This eventually led to the declaration of the Islamic State in Iraq, ISI, in 2006.
Okay.
The source identifies the decision to dissolve the Iraqi army back in 2003 as a long-term and critical flaw. It notes ISIS forces then infiltrated from Syria after the uprising started there in 2011-2012, exploiting the chaos and expanding into Syrian territory.
And connecting it back to Iraq.
The document explicitly links the anti-government protests in Iraq, the political divisions, the ongoing neglect of Sunni districts, factors like a controversial oil contract up north, and support from former Ba'ath officers and Mosul intelligence figures, all contributing to widening grievances that ISIS exploited. It calls ISIS's capture of Mosul in June 2014 a spectacular operation.
Oh, amidst all this chaos and the rise of ISIS, were there any efforts towards national reconciliation mentioned in the source? Attempts to bridge the divides?
Yes, the source does discuss some efforts. It notes attempts by Sunni Arab tribal leaders to get involved in the political process, including a planned conference in Kuwait in 2011. Apparently, the Shia governing elite tried to stop it but failed. Sunni mayors were invited. However, this conference actually led to increased sectarian violence because participants received threats.
Wow, counterproductive.
Yeah. Prominent Sunni Arab figures proposed a broader national reconciliation conference after the 2010 elections. They argued development needed tribal and ethnic reconciliation after all the violence and cleansing. Shiite leaders also called for reconciliation efforts, stressing rulers' obligations to their subjects. Clerics tried to bring Sunni leaders into the mainstream, pushing for acknowledging things like election fraud, including Sunni candidates. Conferences were even held for this purpose.
So it sounds like a period marked by ongoing political instability, yes, popular anger boiling over into protests, the terrifying rise of extremist groups exploiting that post-invasion vacuum, but also these complex, often difficult attempts to try and mend the deep-seated divisions.
That's a very accurate summary of what the source describes for this period. It highlights the persistent political fragility, the really profound consequences of the post-invasion disorder in creating the conditions for ISIS to thrive, and these challenging ongoing efforts towards reconciliation hitting major roadblocks amidst those deep political and sectarian fault lines.
Okay, bringing us right to the end of the document now, and closer to the present day. The source reflects on Iraq's current challenges, its future prospects. What are the key issues it identifies facing the country now?
The source describes Iraq as, well, a complex and multifaceted state, deeply shaped by that long history of invasions, centralized power being imposed over centuries onto this incredibly diverse society, multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. It argues this history, plus the British imposing a European-style state, means Iraq lacks a truly coherent national identity. Politically, the source highlights the sheer number of political parties. It lists around 135. And they're constantly shifting transient coalition arrangements. It notes low public trust in the elections and, disturbingly, the continued killing of activists. Based on all this, the source concludes there's little sign of political stability underpinning the country at present.
And economically?
Economically, the source stresses the crucial need for independence in income sources. That means needing an independent financial system, a national currency, an organized monetary and credit policy. It emphasizes the government needs to take an active economical role in planning and directing economic life, something it says is especially vital for underdeveloped nations lacking those frameworks for growth. Relying just on oil isn't enough.
Right. And socially? What about social cohesion?
This is presented as possibly an insurmountable obstacle. The source points to debates over the importance of political rights versus economic social rights. And crucially, for groups that have been historically treated unjustly, there's this deep need for autonomy to escape prejudice. The document notes growing ethnic consciousness and tensions since 2003, especially the Kurdish-Arab dispute, linking it directly back to past oppression and the disruption of the 2003 invasion.
It sounds like a really difficult mix of political fragmentation, economic dependency, social divisions rooted in history but made worse by recent events.
The source uses pretty strong language. It calls Iraq the richest but for the moment most dysfunctional of countries, lacking even a minimal network of order and trust. It views Iraq as a prime candidate for external intervention, partly because its oil wealth has, paradoxically, become a strategy for disorder.
Wow. Despite all those huge challenges, does the source offer any glimmer of hope? Any perspective on the future?
It does end on a slightly more hopeful note, perhaps. The source suggests Iraq's new international status is a rich potential. It sees this as one of the few opportunities where Iraq's diverse groups can outwit their gigantic neighbors and hold on to supported independence.
Interesting.
And maybe most intriguingly, it suggests that order in the future might ultimately lie with the young, half-innocent youth who know of a world before national or ethnic identities were preferred, looking towards a new generation.
Okay, to wrap up this massive deep dive, the source dedicates its final section to reminding us of Iraq's incredible, irreplaceable cultural legacy. What does it highlight there?
The source calls Iraq's cultural heritage simply unsurpassed. It finds it almost inconceivable, it says, to think of a nation documenting its music for over 4 millennia. It cites examples like a flood tablet mentioning percussion for hymns, artifacts of lyres from way back in the Third period.
4 millennia of music history.
Incredible, right? It really emphasizes that so many civilizations contributed: Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Arabs, Kurds, various Christian groups, all leaving evidence, like ancient Syriac hymns and chants.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, especially about music. What specific traditional art forms or instruments does the source call out?
It particularly associates Iraq with the Arab music genre maqam. It explains maqam means melody. It's an art form with these really intricate melodies that modulate, each governing specific modes and rhythms that evoke distinct emotional states. It notes maqam was performed by musician poets and played important political cultural roles.
Fascinating.
It also highlights the oud, that short-necked string instrument. The source states the oud is widely accepted as an ancestor of the Western lute. It briefly describes how it's made and notes its long history being used in maqam performance, citing evidence going back to an 11th century poet-musician.
The source also reminds us about the physical historical sites, the archaeology.
It does. It calls Iraq a treasure chest of historical sites dating back to ancient times, the land of those peoples we talked about. It notes the region's been a focus for archaeology since the 18th century. The source lists several specific sites. Al-Rafidain Fort, Al-Qaidir mentions Al-Samawiya as likely Sumerian land, Al-Mahajja as the Babylon of Al-Furat, Al-Samwa having ruins from antiquity, Al-Hindiya, Al-Hai as parts of Babylon, and Al-Safra as the believed site of the Hanging Gardens. Just incredible richness.
And tragically, the source also has to address the impact of recent events on this amazing heritage.
Yes, sadly. The source mentions the world became much more aware of these invaluable holdings in a tragic way following the burning and looting of many of these cultural heritage items in April 2003 during a United States-led invasion of Baghdad.
The museum looting.
Exactly. It details widespread devastation damage to mosaics, statues, cuneiform tablets, manuscripts, paintings, archaeological sites, palaces, libraries, museums, churches, archives, right across Iraq. And it notes the destruction did not stop after April. On the contrary, it has rapidly spread.
It paints such a stark, heartbreaking contrast. This deep foundational contribution to world civilization, and then the recent widespread destruction of that very legacy.
That's precisely the contrast the source leaves us with. It underscores Iraq's immense ancient cultural achievements from writing and the wheel to sophisticated music like maqam and the oud, backed by vast archaeology. And then it juxtaposes this sharply with the widespread damage and looting these irreplaceable treasures suffered, particularly in the chaos following the 2003 invasion.
Wow. This deep dive into Iraq's history, guided by this source, has really taken us on quite a journey. From the dawn of civilization through millennia of empires, revolutions, wars, right into this complex, challenging present.
We've really seen the land between the rivers highlighted as, well, the engine of early human innovation, a center of vast empires, golden ages, but also a place repeatedly shaped, sometimes battered by external forces, internal divisions, and these ongoing struggles for self-determination, for stability.
We unpacked the source's view of the specifics, didn't we? Those Mesopotamian inventions, the rise of Islam and Baghdad's Golden Age, the structures and struggles under Ottoman and British rule, the hopes and failures of the monarchy in the '58 revolution.
Right, then the Ba'ath consolidation, the oil nationalization, but also the authoritarianism, the devastating Iran-Iraq and Gulf Wars, the hugely controversial 2003 invasion, and the chaos after the state dissolved.
The tragic rise of sectarian violence, extremist groups like ISIS filling that vacuum, and the ongoing political, economic, social struggles the country still faces, according to this document.
The source really offers that critical long view, doesn't it? It's essential for contextualizing today's challenges. It highlights those persistent tensions, center versus regions, external intervention versus internal identity, the heavy weight of all this history.
So, bringing it back to you, our listener, what does this incredible sweep of history mean when you think about Iraq today?
Well, this history, as presented in this particular source, really compels us to ask an important question, I think. Given Iraq's unparalleled legacy as the cradle of civilization, followed by these centuries marked by cycles of conquest, imposed rule, internal conflict, the struggle for real self-determination, how much of its current complexity and challenges are an inevitable product of these specific historical forces, these external interventions, and how much might be inherent to its unique geography and its profoundly diverse society? It's certainly something to mull over.